Part 4. Here are the directions for Part 4. In this part, you will hear 4 interviews, A through D. Each interview will be followed by 2 questions, number 1 through number 8. For each question, you will have 10 seconds to choose the best answer. The interview and the questions will be given only once. Now, let's listen to the interviews.
A.
We're pleased to have with us in the studio today Mr. Paul Mariner. Paul is an author who has just had his first travel book published. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about your book?
The book is based in Laos, in the north of Laos.
I see. And it's a love story. No, it's just travel, right?
There's no love when I go traveling. It's just a pure and simple travel story about what I saw or experienced when I went around northern Laos.
Why did you decide to write a book about your travels?
I tend to do quite a lot of traveling, and while I do the traveling, I keep quite an extensive notebook. And I just decided to start writing up the notes, and the notes just turned into a book.
What were some of the difficulties involved, if any?
The main problem was research. I think living in Japan, getting hold of adequate material is quite difficult if you're writing an English book. Then it was the difficulty involved in contacting publishers over such a long distance, because the publisher I used was British-based.
Getting away from just your particular book, in your opinion, what makes a good travel story?
I think there are 2 kinds of interesting travel stories. One is that a reader can relate to, like a story that they can see that they can do, that it's not too beyond the bounds of possibility that they could actually do this.
I see.
So that they could associate with it. But also, totally contrary to that, I think another one is just like the kind of story that they know is beyond their reach, so they can lose themselves in an adventure, something that they know they really will never be able to do. Maybe they'd love to do it. So I think totally opposites. Total opposites. But I think they're the 2 kinds of travel books that make for interesting reading.
How is your travel book different from others on the market?
There are not many books that have been written about Laos. There are not many books written about the particular area that I went to in Laos. I spent a lot of time in the jungles visiting some villages that, basically, they'd never seen foreigners before. Laos is it's quite an unexplored country.
How do you feel your publishing company is promoting your book, is supporting the sales of your book?
The publishing industry is something very difficult to get into. First-time authors are not helped that much. If you're a big name, they will invest a lot of money into you. If you're not such a big name, you have to struggle. I don't really have great expectations from this book, but I think it's a stepping stone. The company obviously has a lot of editors, writers that they have to deal with. So the first-time writer, unless it is something exceptional, will be very, very bottom of the ladder, which is where I consider myself to be. But I am on the ladder. But yeah, it's something you just have to put up with.
Thank you very much, Paul, for talking with us today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Questions. Number 1. What was one of the main problems Paul had when writing his book? Number 2. How does Paul feel about the way the publisher is supporting his book? B.
We're in the studio today with Mr. James Rogan, renowned translator, translating from Japanese into English. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today.
It's good to have you here. I understand that mostly you translate fiction, literature.
I translate literature and also essays, and I've also translated a lot of Japanese haiku and some tanka, other poetry.
Has there ever been an occasion where someone came to you with, say, a piece of literature that you just didn't feel a connection with, or that you didn't want to work on?
That certainly happens. One of the things I would say about translating is that, in a way, translation is a great test of the original literature. When you begin to translate it, the real strength or weakness of the writer rapidly becomes apparent.
What are some of the difficulties a translator faces?
Well, I think that there are many difficulties that arise out of the very different nature of Japanese and English as languages. For example, in Japanese, you do not usually have to signal whether a noun is singular or plural, but in English, you must.
Right.
I think it's a very good example of the difference between languages. Actually, we mentioned haiku, but this is terribly important in haiku. There's a famous story about haiku by Matsuo Basho, which is about the crow that settles on the branch in the autumn dusk, that for a long time people thought it was one crow because there was a painting by Basho showing one crow. And then another painting by Basho was uncovered illustrating the same poem that showed 56 crows.
Oh, dear.
And so actually, that shows that just because somebody thinks that it's plural doesn't necessarily mean that it is. In other words, there is always an element of interpretation. And this I've gradually realized with translation, that in a sense each translation is an interpretation of the original, and your skill at interpreting the original will partly depend on your knowledge of the language, but it will also depend on how good a reader you are. And so, the native speaker doesn't necessarily have an advantage over the foreigner in that respect.
James, what advice would you give someone who wants to become a translator?
One of the things I feel is, these days in Japan, there are more and more bilingual people.
Yes?
You know, there are more and more, say, Americans who've grown up in Japan, Japanese who've grown up in America.
Right. Okay.
And I often have chances to teach or to read the translations of bilingual people. But the interesting thing is that where I feel they fall down is that, for example, if they're translating into English, their knowledge of English literature, their ability to write readable prose, all of these things are, in a way, very weak. And I think that people, if they focus too much on just, do I understand the original? Can I express it in the other language? Then they miss the fact that actually translation demands a great deal more than that. So that what I feel is, it's not enough to be bilingual. You have to be bicultural. And to be bicultural is extremely difficult and demanding.
Yes.
But it involves, at the least, if you're interested in literary translation, it involves having a good knowledge of the literature of both languages.
Well, I know I certainly learned a lot today about translating and how challenging the job is. Thank you very much for your wisdom.
Thank you very much for having me.
Questions. Number 3. What did Rogan wish to illustrate when he mentioned the paintings of Matsuo Basho? Number 4. What advice does Rogan give people wanting to become good translators? C. Welcome back. We have with us in the studio today Mr. Elliot Johnson. Mr. Johnson is the CEO of Executive Solutions, which is an executive search firm. We'll be talking with him and asking him a number of questions in this short interview. Mr. Johnson, how would you describe, if you could, the kind of work that you do?
We're called an executive search firm, and there's a real difference that needs to be stated here. We're not a people or placement agency. We don't find jobs for people. What we do is we work with organizations who are our clients, to then look at the market to see where these people might exist that they're looking for.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this kind of work often called headhunting? Is that a term that you would prefer or that you would use?
It's a good question. A lot of people actually do refer to what I do as being a headhunter or headhunting. We prefer not to use that term. It's something which I think has negative connotations. We're a lot more interested in more than just someone's head. We really want to get to know the people that we're working with. We don't see them as a commodity, as just a product, but really as someone who we will partner with for their future career. What we do has a huge impact on their lives and their careers, and, of course, with the clients that we introduce them to. So we prefer to go by the term of recruiter or executive recruiter.
Excellent. What advice would you give to someone, say, who wanted to become an executive recruiter?
I think it would be someone who has to have a passion to see good people and good companies get together. This is more of a question of what motivates someone. People need to have a sense of urgency. They want to get things done. They hate procrastination. Being a very competitive industry, if a client has asked me to find someone for them, they've not necessarily only asked me. There could be a number of other recruiters working on a similar assignment. So really, time is of the essence. People have to get moving and start tapping into their network of contacts and contacting potential candidates for the position.
That's interesting. Now, you've mentioned that you're operating here in Japan. What are some difficulties you faced in starting your company in Japan?
Being a non-Japanese person here in Japan, there were some language difficulties, of course. There was a lot of contract work that needed to be completed and a lot of dealing with various bureaucratic organizations to get licenses for the kind of work that we do. Probably one of the biggest difficulties we had was actually finding real estate for our office.
Uh-huh.
We had, let me think, I think we approached around 20 real estate agents, and only 5 wanted to speak to us. Not just because we were a foreign-led organization, but also because we were a startup organization and didn't have a history of revenue growth. We were fortunate enough to find a very accepting real estate agent who did wonders for us in introducing us to a number of properties. And our current location and our landlord and all of that has gone very smoothly, and things are going very well.
Thank you very much for talking with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Questions. Number 5. Why does Elliot Johnson prefer not to use the term headhunting for his work? Number 6. According to Elliot Johnson, what was the biggest obstacle in starting his own company? D.
Hello, welcome to Business Talk Today. I'm Janet Walsh, your host. And today we have a special guest, Mr. Robert Hilk, Senior Consultant for an intercultural training firm. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Janet.
Welcome to Business Talk.
Thanks very much for having me.
Could you tell me exactly what an intercultural training firm is?
Well, what we do is we try to provide our clients with skills that they need in order to function efficiently inside of an intercultural environment. Now, intercultural environment doesn't necessarily mean only Japanese and non-Japanese. In a sense, these kind of communication skills that we try to teach will empower the people and make it possible for them to function very well even in a domestic environment, which means that when they work with other Japanese, for example, they also are able to communicate more effectively, because ultimately it's about communication.
Now, could your program benefit someone who's, let's say, going to a non-English speaking country?
Absolutely. Intentionally, we do present our program primarily as a comparison between the United States and Japan. And the reason we do that is not because Japan and the United States are the two economically most powerful countries at all. We do it because they represent endpoints on a continuum. There exists some continuum. It's not a black and white situation. The real world is basically various shades of gray. So, by comparing the United States and Japan in so many different ways, in terms of meeting style, for example, or in terms of education style, or in terms of, for example, human relationships and the importance of human relationships in doing business, or how much of the message is sent directly by words, and how much of it is shared information based on the context, based on the situation. Japan and the United States do represent those endpoints. Then we show that the participants how it will relate to the country that they are going to do business in.
So, Robert, tell me, how long have you been doing this?
Well, gee, intercultural communication for me goes way back until, more than 30 years when I was in the Army. You may be very surprised, but the U.S. Army actually is one of the more progressive social institutions in the United States.
Oh, yeah? I'm very surprised.
Primarily because the Army has the power to be able to mandate things. For example, gender equality or racial equality. Actually, I was a trainer for racial equality issues back in the 1970s.
So, what are the differences between then and now?
20 years ago, or 25 years ago, no one was really interested in intercultural communication. They thought intercultural communication is a kind, we are the world kind of thing like that. But now, many companies have recognized that intercultural communication is a skill, and it's a skill that impacts directly on the bottom line. If you send one of your workers into an intercultural situation and she doesn't know what to expect, she's going to experience quite a bit of dislocation. She's going to be confused. She's not going to be able to read the signals correctly. She maybe even makes some mistakes that offend people, and you lose the contract.
Now, Robert, is your company also helping top management from overseas get used to Japanese culture?
You know, we would really like to, but unfortunately, a lot of top managers in American companies in particular, I'm sorry to single out Americans, but a lot of American companies have the idea that, America is number one. We're the most powerful country. We don't need intercultural communication. Intercultural communication equals other people learn about us. It's a kind of ISO mentality. They don't really see the need for doing it. And that's really a shame.
That is a shame, yes.
Because it should go in both directions, and it needs to.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for talking with us today. It's been very interesting, and I wish you all the success in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Questions. Number 7. According to Robert, why does his program present a comparison between the United States and Japan? Number 8. According to Robert, how has the view of intercultural communication changed in recent years?
これでこの CD は終わりです。